You've been there before. A position that looks completely locked, where every plan you consider dissolves before it starts, and the clock keeps running. Most players facing a fortress either wait and hope or push and collapse. Here's the real story. The toughest defensive structures are built on logic that runs deeper than a wall of pawns. Cracking them means reading where the tension hides and using plans most never try. That's what this training guide is for. We're diving deep into the art of dismantling the most resilient defensive setups in chess. This guide works through the structural logic that makes each defensive system resilient, trains you to locate the weaknesses hidden inside closed pawn chains, and builds the concrete techniques that convert a locked position into a winning one. Along the way, you will study the named defensive systems that appear most often in serious play, from the King's-Indian and Benoni to the French, Caro-Kann, Sicilian, Hedgehog, Slav, and the piece-based fortresses of the Nimzo-Indian complex. By the end, you'll understand how to target the load-bearing centers of these positions. If this kind of deep structural training is what you have been looking for, subscribing and leaving a comment helps more people find it. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. What makes a defense a fortress? In chess, a fortress is more than just a solid position. This distinction is crucial and deserves careful consideration. When a position is solid, the defender has organized their pieces well, covered weaknesses, and made life difficult for the attacker. However, solid does not mean impenetrable. A solid position can still be pressured. The attacker can probe, regroup, open a new file, target a slightly weak pawn, or simply improve a piece and wait for the right moment. Progress is slow, but it is possible. The defender must keep working, adjusting, and staying alert, because the position can still tip. A fortress is something different. In a fortress, the attacker genuinely cannot make progress. Not just slowly. Not just with difficulty. The position is structured in a way that the standard methods of applying pressure simply do not work. The defender has closed off the access routes, leaving the attacker with no realistic way to create new ones. The position has a kind of finality to it, marking it as a fortress, rather than just a tough defensive setup. Two things must be true for a position to qualify. First, the defender has eliminated all meaningful paths into the position. There is no open file the attacker can use to penetrate, no weak square the attacker can occupy, no diagonal aimed at a vulnerable king. The defensive structure has been organized so that every obvious route in has been blocked or covered. Second, the attacker cannot create new weaknesses. This is the part that often gets overlooked. A position might be sealed up right now, but if the attacker can force a pawn trade that opens a file, or maneuver a piece to a square that disrupts the structure, then the fortress is not complete. A true fortress denies both of those things. The avenues of penetration are gone, and the attacker has no lever to pry them back open. When both conditions are met, the result is a draw, regardless of how much material or positional advantage the stronger side holds. A player can be up a full rook, have the bishop pair, and control more space, and still be unable to win against a properly constructed fortress. The material count stops being the story. What matters is whether progress is possible, and in a fortress, it is not. It helps to understand what no meaningful entry point actually looks like in practice. These are the squares, files, and diagonals through which an attacker can bring force to bear on the defender's position. A blocked entry square is one that the attacker's pieces cannot reach, either because a pawn controls it, because the defender's own pieces occupy or cover it, or because the geometry of the position simply does not allow access. When those squares are consistently controlled, and the structure that controls them is stable, the attacker is left pushing against a wall. There is nowhere to go. Now, there are two broad categories of fortress, and they work differently enough that it is worth treating them separately. The first is the endgame fortress. This is the more commonly discussed version. It arises when a materially inferior side reaches an endgame, where the stronger side's extra material cannot be converted into a win. A classic example in principle would be a side with a rook versus a side with only a bishop and a pawn, where the pawn is fixed on a corner square of the opposite color to the bishop, and the defending king has reached that corner and cannot be driven out. The rook cannot force the king away, and the bishop cannot defend the pawn from a distance if the king is needed elsewhere. Yet the structure holds because the attacker has no way to make progress without allowing stalemate or losing the pawn. The material is unequal, but the structure makes the win impossible. In endgame fortresses, king position and entry squares are key. The weaker side's king finds a corner or a zone it cannot be evicted from, and the stronger side's extra material has no way to force it out. The pawn structure is often fixed, meaning there are no pawn breaks available to open new lines. The position is static, and in a true fortress, static means drawn. The second category is the middle game defensive formation. This is less about raw material and more about positional compensation. A side might be behind in space or have a passive piece arrangement, but they have built a pawn chain and piece setup that neutralizes the opponent's positional advantages. The pawn chain matters here because pawn structure is relatively static. Pawns are the least mobile pieces on the board, and once a pawn structure is fixed, it tends to stay that way. Weaknesses in pawn structure, like isolated pawns, backward pawns, or holes on key squares, are typically difficult to fix once they appear. A middle game fortress turns that stability into a defensive tool. The defender fixes the pawn structure in a way that blocks the opponent's most active pieces, closes off the dangerous diagonals, and denies the opponent's knights or bishops their best squares. A knight on a permanent outpost illustrates how a single piece can anchor a middle game fortress. If the defender places a knight on a central square like e4 or d5, and the opponent has no pawn to dislodge it, that knight becomes a fixture. It controls key squares, it blocks lines, and it gives the defender a stable reference point around which the rest of the defensive setup can be organized. A blocked diagonal works similarly. If the attacker has a powerful bishop aimed at the king, but a fixed pawn chain closes the diagonal permanently, that bishop becomes much less dangerous. The attacker still has the piece, but it has lost most of its influence. The techniques for breaking an endgame fortress and a middle game fortress are quite different, which is why it matters to recognize which type you are dealing with. Against an endgame fortress, the attacker is often looking for a way to force a pawn move that opens a line, or to find a Zugzwang idea that forces the defender to abandon a key square. Against a middle game fortress, the attacker needs to find a way to undermine the pawn structure itself, or to reroute pieces to angles the fortress was not designed to handle. Those are different problems, and they require different thinking. Getting clear on the type of fortress in front of you is the first step toward finding any plan at all. This brings up why fortresses are so difficult to face in practice, and it is worth looking at this from two angles. The concrete difficulty is straightforward. When you are the attacker, your standard toolkit involves finding weaknesses and targeting them. You look for an isolated pawn, an exposed king, a poorly placed piece, an open file you can use. Chess planning at almost every level is built around identifying something to attack. A fortress removes that. There is no weak pawn to target, because the structure is sound. There is no open file because the position is closed. There is no entry square because every relevant square is covered. The attacker is left without a plan, not because they are playing badly, but because the position genuinely offers nothing. This can be a disorienting experience, especially for players who are used to having the better position and expecting to convert it. The psychological difficulty is just as real. When you have more material or a clear positional edge, there is a natural expectation that the win is there if you just keep pressing. Facing a fortress challenges that expectation directly. The position resists. Every attempt to improve comes to nothing. The defender just sits there, makes small adjustments, and the position does not change. Over time, the attacker starts to feel the pressure of the situation, not from any threat the defender is making, but from the frustration of having an advantage that cannot be used. That pressure can lead to impatience, and impatience leads to the kind of reckless pawn pushes or piece sacrifices that actually break the attacker's own structure and hand the defender something to work with. A common mistake is to think that playing more aggressively solves the problem. It does not. Aggression without a concrete plan tends to create new weaknesses on the attacker's side. A well-constructed fortress will not yield simply because of how forcefully you push against it, if there is no structural reason for it to give way. What the attacker needs is not more energy, but more clarity about why the fortress holds. That means identifying which specific features are doing the defensive work. Is it the fixed pawn chain? The knight on the outpost? The blocked diagonal? The king's position in a corner that cannot be reached? Once the attacker understands which features are load-bearing, they can start asking whether any of those features can be disrupted. If none of them can, then the honest assessment is that the position is drawn, and the attacker's energy is better spent not making it worse. Good defense, for its part, is not passive waiting. The defender who builds a fortress has made active, purposeful decisions. They chose when to fix the pawn structure, which squares to control, which pieces to trade, and which to keep. Blocking open lines and covering entry squares are deliberate acts, not accidents. The defender who understands the fortress they are building can maintain it with calm, stubborn precision, making only the moves necessary to preserve the structure without creating new problems. What a fortress really represents is a position where the usual relationship between advantage and outcome has been severed. Normally, more material or a better position translates into winning chances. A fortress cuts that connection. The advantage exists, but it cannot be converted because the structure denies the attacker any path forward. Recognizing that a position has reached that state, whether you are the one building it or the one trying to break it, is the starting point for thinking clearly about what to do next. Chapter 2. Reading the fortress before attacking it. Before you can attack a fortress, you need to read it. That sounds obvious, but most failed attempts to break a fortress share the same root cause. The attacker moved before they understood what they were looking at. They pushed a pawn because it felt active, or traded a piece because it seemed like the right direction, and only a few moves later realized they had either reinforced the structure they were trying to dismantle or created a weakness in their own position. The evaluation has to come first. There is a specific sequence of questions worth working through before committing to any plan. Not because chess requires a rigid checklist, but because fortresses are built to confuse attackers. The defensive pieces often look passive. The pawn structure often looks immovable. The entry points are often invisible until you train yourself to see them. Working through the positions systematically is what makes the difference between a plan that has a real chance and one that just burns moves. The first question is, what is holding this structure together? Every fortress has a load-bearing center, something that, if it moved or were exchanged, would cause the whole defensive setup to collapse. That thing is the anchor. It might be a piece sitting on a key square, a pawn that is blocking a file, or a square itself that the defender has committed to controlling at all costs. The anchor is not always the most visually prominent feature of the position. In fact, it is often a piece that appears to be doing very little. It is not attacking anything. It is not threatening a capture. It is just sitting there. And that is exactly why it matters. A piece that looks passive, but is preventing a critical entry, is doing important work. The confusion happens because we tend to evaluate pieces by what they threaten. A knight that is attacking two pawns feels active and valuable. A bishop that is sitting in the corner feels irrelevant. But in a fortress, that bishop might be the only thing preventing your rook from penetrating a key file. Remove it, and the position opens up completely. Leave it alone, and you can press for a long time without making any real progress. The habit to build here is to ask, for every defensive piece, what would happen if it were not there? Not what it is threatening right now, but what it is preventing. Work through the position piece by piece. If you remove the knight from that square, can your king advance? If the bishop were gone, would the d-file become accessible? If that pawn were not blocking the diagonal, could your rook swing to a more active position? One of those questions will produce a more dramatic answer than the others. Once you have found it, the entire character of your planning changes. Instead of asking where to push or which piece to activate, you are now asking a more focused question. How do I remove or deflect this specific piece from this specific function? This approach makes the problem more manageable, and it is the right problem to be solving. With the anchor identified, the next task is to map the entry points. Most entry points in a fortress are not currently available. The defender has covered them, blocked them, or placed a piece that controls them. What you are doing in this step is not looking at where you can go right now. You are looking at where you could go if something changed. This requires a specific kind of visualization. You have to mentally remove a defensive piece, or imagine a pawn having advanced, and then ask what the board would look like in that altered state. Where would your king be able to go? Which file would your rook be able to use? Which diagonal would open up for your bishop? The answers to those questions are your latent entry points, and cataloging them before you move is essential. The reason this matters is that fortresses typically have more than one potential entry point, but they are not all equally useful. Some would require several moves to reach. Some would require the defender to make an unlikely concession. Some are genuinely available if you find the right sequence. If you commit to attacking one entry point without having surveyed the others, you might spend 10 moves pursuing an approach that was never going to work, while a cleaner path sat unused elsewhere in the position. There is also a real danger in attacking the wrong entry point. It can make your own structure worse. Pawn advances that open lines toward a specific entry point sometimes create weaknesses in your own camp at the same time. If that entry point turns out to be well defended, and you cannot penetrate it, you are now dealing with a fortress and a self-inflicted weakness. The time spent cataloging entry points is not passive thinking. It is what protects you from that outcome. Once you know where the entry points are, you need to understand which defensive pieces are genuinely free and which are stretched. An overloaded piece in a fortress is one that is responsible for defending more than one critical square or function at the same time. It might be a rook that is covering both a key rank and a key file. It might be a bishop that is controlling the entry square on one diagonal, while also preventing a pawn advance on another. The piece looks solid because it is doing its job, but it is doing two jobs simultaneously, and that is a vulnerability. The way to find overloaded pieces is to ask the same removal question you used to find the anchor, but this time apply it more broadly. For each defensive piece, ask, if this piece moved to handle one of its responsibilities, what would happen to the other? If the rook slides to defend against your king advance, does the file open up? If the bishop retreats to stop your pawn, does the entry square become accessible? When the answer to both halves of that question is something bad for the defender, the piece is overloaded. The confusion to watch out for here is between a piece that looks passive and a piece that is genuinely overloaded. A passive piece is one that is not doing much. It is sitting somewhere because the defender ran out of better squares, and it is not covering anything critical. An overloaded piece can also look quiet, but it is covering two things at once. The distinction matters because a passive piece is a target of a different kind. It is a candidate for exchange if simplification helps you, or simply something to ignore. An overloaded piece is a target because forcing it to choose between its two responsibilities is how you create a crack in the fortress. Knights deserve special attention in this evaluation. Unlike a bishop, which becomes ineffective when key weaknesses are fixed on the color complex it does not control, a knight can attack pawns and squares of either color. That color independence often makes it the most flexible piece for pressuring an overloaded defender. After you have identified the anchor, catalogued the entry points, and located the overloaded defenders, you have enough information to think about the pawn lever. The pawn lever is the moment when your evaluation becomes a concrete plan. The goal is to open a line, create a new weakness, or force the defender's pawns into a configuration that exposes the entry points you have already identified. The critical distinction is between identifying the correct lever and simply pushing pawns. Those are not the same thing. A pawn advance that looks aggressive but targets a well-supported part of the structure may accomplish nothing except giving the defender a clearer target. Worse, it might actually help the fortress. If your pawn advance allows the defender to close a line they needed to keep closed, or to trade off a pawn that was creating tension, you have done their work for them. The correct lever is the one that targets the specific structural feature you identified in your earlier evaluation. If the anchor is a pawn blocking a key file, the lever might be the advance that forces that pawn to move or be captured. If the overloaded piece is a bishop covering two diagonals, the lever might be the advance that forces it to choose. The lever should connect directly to the weakness you have already found. If it does not connect to anything you identified in your evaluation, it is probably the wrong lever. Timing is the other half of this. Even the correct lever can fail if played too early. A fortress is a coordinated structure, and the defender's pieces are arranged to respond to exactly the kind of pressure you are planning to apply. If you advance the lever before your own pieces are in position to exploit the opening it creates, the defender may be able to close the position again, or simply wait out the pressure until your initiative fades. The lever should come after your pieces are already aimed at the entry points that the lever will open. The advance and the follow-up need to be part of the same sequence, not two separate ideas. Instead of looking at a fortress and asking where do I push, you are asking a sequence of more precise questions. Where is the anchor? Where are the latent entry points? Which defenders are overloaded? And which pawn advance connects all of that into a concrete plan? Each question narrows the problem. By the time you reach the lever, you are not guessing. You are executing a plan that is grounded in what the position actually requires. Impulsive action against a fortress rarely fails for lack of effort. More often, it fails because the attacker was solving the wrong problem. The evaluation described here is what makes sure you are solving the right one. Chapter 3: The King's Indian and Benoni Fortresses. The King's Indian and Benoni are two of the most frequently encountered defensive formations in practical chess, and they are not the same structure. That distinction matters. Treating them as interchangeable is a frequent error that leads attackers to apply the wrong plan, because each one has its own internal logic, its own anchor, and its own set of vulnerabilities. The breaking methods that work against one will often fail against the other if applied without adjustment. The King's Indian formation is built around two recognizable features. Black places pawns on d6 and e5, creating a chain that points toward the center and develops the king's bishop to g7 via a fianchetto. That bishop on g7 is not a decorative piece. It sits on the long diagonal running from g7 through the center toward a1, and from that square it coordinates with the pawn chain to suppress white's piece activity across a wide portion of the board. The closed center is the third element, and it is the one most often misread by attackers. A closed center in the King's Indian is not a neutral condition that simply happened. Black has deliberately engineered it. The pawns on d6 and e5 lock the central files and prevent white's pieces from finding natural routes forward. White's pieces, especially the knights and the light-squared bishop, lose their natural activity when those central files are sealed. This is the structural logic of the formation. Black accepts a cramped position in exchange for a structure that neutralizes white's development advantage. The g7 bishop is the anchor of this entire setup. It controls the long diagonal, coordinates with the pawn chain, and gives black's position a coherence it would not otherwise have. Remove that bishop, or drive it off its diagonal, and the pawn chain on d6 and e5 becomes less coordinated. The squares it was indirectly defending become more accessible. This is why identifying what can be done about the g7 bishop must come before committing to any plan. A pawn advance or piece maneuver launched without resolving that question will find the structure absorbing pressure rather than yielding to it. The structure will absorb pressure as long as that bishop is active, because it is doing too much defensive work for the attacker to make progress around it. A common assumption is that the closed center simply means both sides are waiting. That is wrong. Black is actively maintaining the closure. The pawn chain requires support, the queen side must be kept locked, and the bishop must be kept on its diagonal. If white can disrupt any one of those conditions, the structure begins to loosen. But the attacker has to identify which condition is most vulnerable before committing to a plan. The Benoni structure operates on a different set of principles, and the differences are concrete enough that they change what the attacker must do. In the Benoni, black does not create a pawn chain on d6 and e5 in the same way. Instead, black typically has a pawn on d6 and an e-pawn that has either been exchanged or remains on e6, leaving the e-file more open than in the King's Indian. The center is not closed in the same way. White typically holds a queenside space advantage and a pawn majority on that side of the board. That asymmetry is the defining feature of the position. What makes the Benoni fortress-like is not a locked center, but black's capacity to seal off the queenside. Black can advance queenside pawns in a way that neutralizes white's spatial advantage entirely, leaving that extra space with no productive outlet. Once that lockdown is complete, white's queenside majority becomes static. The space exists, but cannot be converted into entry points, because the pawn structure has been sealed against it. The critical difference from the King's Indian is timing. In the King's Indian, the fortress structure is largely already in place by the time the middle game is underway. The attacker is dealing with a formation that has already consolidated. In the Benoni, the fortress is something black is still building. The lockdown is a process, not a starting condition. That means the attacker has a window. If white can execute the queenside advance, particularly the c4 to c5 break, before black completes the seal, the structure never becomes a true fortress. The space advantage gets converted into pressure before black can neutralize it. Recognizing when that lockdown is 1 or 2 moves away is the specific skill the Benoni demands. If white delays the c4 to c5 advance, or mishandles the preparation for it, black stabilizes the pawn structure, and white's queenside majority becomes a liability rather than an asset. The space is there, but it produces nothing. That is the error pattern in Benoni positions. White waits too long, the window closes, and what was an advantage becomes a static feature that black can simply ignore. With both structures understood, the breaking methods become easier to evaluate because you can match each method to the specific vulnerabilities of the formation you are facing. The minority attack is the first method worth understanding. The idea is to advance a smaller number of pawns into a larger pawn majority on the queenside, not to win material directly, but to create a structural weakness, a backward pawn, or an isolated pawn that forces the defender to abandon a key square or disrupt piece coordination. The minority attack is most relevant in positions where black's queenside pawns are fixed and cannot easily advance to meet the pressure. It is a method that works on the structure rather than on the pieces, and its effects tend to be durable because pawn weaknesses, once created, are difficult to remedy. The f4 to f5 advance is the second method, and it targets the King's Indian pawn chain directly. The pawn on e5 is the forward point of black's chain. An advance of white's f-pawn to f5 challenges that chain and threatens to open the f-file, or force black's pawn structure into a less stable configuration. This plan is most effective when black's pieces are already committed to queenside defense and cannot regroup quickly enough to meet the kingside pressure. Timing matters here. An f4 to f5 advance, launched before black's pieces are overextended, will be absorbed because black still has the flexibility to redirect defenders. The advance works when black has already spent that flexibility. The third method is piece regrouping to a knight outpost, and this is often the prerequisite for the other two rather than an alternative to them. A knight placed on a dominant central square, particularly d5, in King's Indian positions, does something specific. It occupies a key square on the long diagonal and reduces the g7 bishop's influence. The bishop controls that diagonal, but a knight on d5 occupies one of its key squares and restricts what the bishop can coordinate with. This is not a direct trade of the bishop. It is a neutralization. The bishop is still on g7, but its practical influence on the game has been reduced. The reason piece regrouping must often come first is that pawn advances without improved piece placement tend to fail. If white advances pawns before pieces are well placed, the structure absorbs the advance. Black's pieces, already coordinated around the pawn chain, can respond efficiently. But if white first improves piece placement, particularly by establishing a knight on an outpost that restricts black's defensive coordination, then the subsequent pawn advance meets a defender that is already under pressure from multiple directions. The structure has less capacity to absorb the second problem when it is already managing the first. This sequencing is the core practical insight for both formations. Piece improvement first. Pawn action second. The attacker who ignores this order will find the structure resilient, while the one who adheres to it will encounter fewer defenses. Consider how these principles come together in a King's Indian position, where the attacker has correctly diagnosed the anchor and identified the G7 bishop as the key defensive piece. The attacker's first task is not to launch a pawn advance, but to find a route for a knight toward D5. That rerouting may take 2 or 3 moves and may look passive from the outside. It is not passive. It is the preparation that makes everything else possible. Once the knight reaches D5, the G7 bishop's diagonal is partially blocked. Black's defensive coordination around the pawn chain is reduced. The overloaded defenders identified in the diagnostic process are now under additional pressure because the knight on D5 is controlling squares they were previously able to cover. At that point, a queenside advance, or an F4 to F5 plan, becomes genuinely threatening, because Black's pieces cannot respond to 2 problems at once. The moment of commitment, the specific move or sequence where the attacker stops improving and starts advancing, is the decision point that separates a well-executed plan from an impulsive one. In King's Indian positions, that moment arrives when the knight is on its outpost. The G7 bishop's influence is reduced, and Black's defenders are already stretched. Advancing before those conditions are met is premature. Waiting after they are met is a missed opportunity. In Benoni positions, the moment of commitment is different because the window is time-sensitive. The attacker must recognize when Black is 1 or 2 moves from completing the queenside lockdown and initiate the C4 to C5 break before that happens. Waiting for perfect piece placement in a Benoni can mean the window closes entirely. The skill is reading the position accurately enough to know whether there is still time to prepare or whether the advance must happen now. What both structures share is that the attacker's success depends on reading the specific defensive logic of the formation rather than applying generic pressure. The King's Indian requires neutralizing the G7 bishop before advancing. The Benoni requires acting before the lockdown is complete. Impatience won't yield results, and neither will waiting indefinitely. The attacker who understands which formation they are facing and what that formation's specific vulnerabilities are is the one who finds the break. Chapter 4: The Caro-Kann and French Defensive Walls. The French defense and the Caro-Kann are often grouped together as solid, defensive responses to 1e4. Both defenses build compact pawn structures in the center. Both are designed to limit White's attacking options and create a stable defensive wall. However, the structural logic underneath each one is different, which changes everything about how you attack them. The diagnostic framework from earlier chapters applies here in the same way it did to the King's Indian and Benoni. The questions do not change. What changes is what the answers reveal, because the French and Caro-Kann have different load-bearing features, and that difference is the whole point of this chapter. Start with the French. Black's setup in the French defense is built around 2 pawns, one on e6 and one on d5. Those 2 pawns form a chain that gives Black a firm grip on the center. The d5 pawn in particular acts as an anchor. It holds the center together, prevents White from occupying e4 with a piece, and supports the overall defensive formation. The chain is genuinely solid. White cannot simply walk through it. But that same chain creates a problem for Black. The pawn on e6 sits directly in front of Black's light-squared bishop. That bishop starts on c8, and with a pawn planted on e6, it has almost nowhere to go. The diagonal it would normally use is blocked by its own pawn. In French defense literature, this piece is often called the bad bishop, and the name is accurate. It is not contributing to the defense. It is not threatening anything. It is sitting behind a wall that black built. That passivity is the structural signature of the French. When you apply the diagnostic framework, that bishop is the first thing to identify, because it is simultaneously the formation's biggest weakness and a potential resource. Those two things sound contradictory, but they are both true at the same time. Here is why. The passive piece is a weakness because it is inactive. White can maintain pressure on the light squares around black's king without worrying about that bishop contesting them. Squares like e5, d6, and g5 become available to white's pieces precisely because the bishop that would normally challenge them is stuck behind the e6 pawn. White can post a knight on e5, and it tends to stay there, since no pawn can easily challenge it. White can use the g5 square without that bishop interfering. The passivity of the bishop is what makes those entry points available. But the bishop is also a resource, because if black manages to get it out, the attacker loses the primary target. One standard method is a maneuver to d7, and then to e8 or b5, or alternatively out via a6, where it can sometimes be exchanged for white's bishop on d3 or e2. Once that exchange happens, the structural weakness disappears. The anchor white was leaning on is gone. That changes the evaluation of the position entirely. So the first diagnostic question in any French position is not about pawn levers or piece placement. It is about that bishop. Is it still passive? If yes, the attacker has a primary target and a range of plans that exploit it. If no, if black has rerouted it or exchanged it, the attacker needs to recalibrate because the most reliable structural pressure point has been removed. A common assumption about the French is that it is simply a slow, passive defense that gets ground down over time. That misreads the position. The evaluation can shift quickly depending on the bishop's status. A French position where the passive piece is still locked behind the e6 pawn is genuinely vulnerable to direct pressure. A French position where the bishop has escaped or been exchanged is a much more resilient structure, and treating both the same way leads to choosing the wrong plan. The Caro-Kann makes the contrast clear from the first move. The Caro-Kann begins with black playing c6 before pushing d5. That sequence matters structurally because it means black develops the light-squared bishop before the center closes. In the French, the center closes first, and the bishop gets trapped. In the Caro-Kann, black gets the bishop out to f5 or g4 before the pawn chain locks it in. The result is a solid pawn structure without a chronically passive piece. That single difference removes the attacker's most reliable target. There is no passive piece to exploit. There is no diagonal pressure that works by pointing pieces at a passive piece on c8. The Caro-Kann fortress is solid precisely because it does not have that built-in structural liability. What that means for the attacker is that the diagnostic framework produces a different result. When you look for the anchor in a Caro-Kann position, you find a compact pawn structure with no obvious passive piece to target. The latent entry points are still there, but they are not opened by exploiting a single weak piece. They require creating imbalances through piece activity, pawn advances, or structural pressure on the queenside or center. The attacker's task is more complex because there is no single obvious target to aim at. White's typical plans in Caro-Kann positions involve queenside pressure with moves like b4 and b5, targeting the c6 pawn and the structure behind it. Or central pressure with e5 and c4, attacking the d5 anchor directly and restricting black's knight development. Neither of these is as clean as pointing everything at a passive bishop, because black's pieces are better coordinated and can contest the pressure more actively. Black can exchange minor pieces on e4 or d4, place rooks on c8 and e8, and neutralize white's activity through simplification. The Caro-Kann is not easier to attack than the French. In some ways it is harder, precisely because the structural weakness that makes the French vulnerable does not exist. With that contrast established, the three main breaking methods come into focus, and the key point is that the choice between them is not arbitrary. It follows directly from the diagnostic work. The first method is the center opening sacrifice. This works when the passive piece in a French position is still passive, and the center can be cracked open before black reorganizes. A sacrifice on d5 or e6, giving up a piece to break the pawn chain, gives white's pieces immediate activity in a position where black's cramped formation cannot respond quickly. The passive piece is still locked away, the king is exposed, and the open center gives white's pieces access to squares black cannot cover. The timing is everything here. If the passive piece has already escaped or been exchanged, the sacrifice loses its justification, because black's pieces are no longer cramped enough to make the compensation work. Against the Caro-Kann, this method is far less reliable. The center opening sacrifice that works against a French structure depends on black's pieces being passive and the light squares being weak. In the Caro-Kann, black's pieces are better placed, and the light squares are not compromised in the same way. Trying to apply French-style diagonal pressure in a Caro-Kann position is a common mistake, because the bishop that would be the target has already moved. The second method is the queenside minority attack. This involves advancing pawns on the queenside, typically b4 and b5, to create a backward pawn on c6, or an isolated pawn on d5. It works in both French and Caro-Kann structures, when the center is stable and the attacker has rooks on b1 and c1, ready to use the files that open. The minority attack is a slower, more positional approach, and it is particularly well suited to Caro-Kann positions, where there is no passive piece to exploit directly. It creates a structural weakness that did not exist before, and gives the attacker a long-term target. The third method is the kingside pawn storm. When black has castled kingside, and the center is closed, advancing pawns with f4 and f5 in French positions, or h4 and h5 in Caro-Kann positions, aims to open files against the king. In French structures, this approach benefits from the light squares around black's king being less well defended because of the passive piece's passivity. In Caro-Kann structures, the kingside pawn storm still works when the center is locked, but it requires more direct piece support because black's defensive coverage is better. The error to avoid is treating these two defenses as interchangeable when selecting a plan. They look similar from a distance. Both are solid, both feature central pawn chains, both aim to neutralize white's attacking options. But the light-squared bishop difference is structural, and it changes which method the position actually supports. Choosing a center opening sacrifice in a Caro-Kann position, because it worked in a French position, is choosing a method the structure does not support. The worked example that brings this together is Tal against Botvinnik from their World Championship match in 1960. Botvinnik was a well-known practitioner of solid central structures, and the 1960 match featured several positions where Tal's willingness to sacrifice material against cramped formations was the defining theme. The diagnostic principle illustrated by those games is consistent with what this chapter describes. When the defender's pieces are passive, and a key bishop has not been freed, a center opening sacrifice can be justified on structural grounds rather than pure calculation. The attacker checks whether the passive piece is still locked away, whether the defender's pieces are cramped enough that they cannot respond to the open center, and whether the resulting activity outweighs the material cost. When those conditions are met, the sacrifice is a structural decision, not a speculative one. The transferable principle is precise. In French positions, the timing of a center opening sacrifice depends directly on whether the passive piece has been activated. That single diagnostic check determines whether the sacrifice is sound or premature. Tar checked it. The bishop was still passive. The sacrifice worked. Chapter 5. The Sicilian Najdorf and Dragon Defensive Labyrinths. The Sicilian variations work on a principle distinct from the Caro-Kann and French. They create resilience through activity. The defender is not trying to lock the position down. The defender is constantly threatening to make something happen, and that threat is what makes the attacker's job so difficult. That distinction matters because it changes the attacker's problem completely. Against a French or Caro-Kann wall, the core question is how to open lines through a fixed structure. Against a Sicilian defensive labyrinth, the core question is how to press forward without giving the defender the counterplay they are waiting for. The structure is not rigid. The danger is dynamic. The Najdorf starts from a specific pawn setup. Black plays the Sicilian with a pawn on c5, then adds a6 as the defining move of the variation. The typical middle game structure has Black's pawns on a6, b5, c5, and d6, with a choice between placing the e-pawn on e5 or e6. That choice shapes everything about how Black defends and counterattacks. With the e-pawn on e5, Black creates a solid central presence, but accepts a weakness on d5. With the e-pawn on e6, Black keeps more flexibility, but the position is slightly more cramped. Both configurations share the same core defensive logic, which is that Black's pieces have active roles, and the position is never truly static. The Queen's bishop is central to this. In many Najdorf lines it reaches active squares early, sometimes coming to g4 to pin a knight, sometimes swinging to e6 or b7 to control key diagonals. This is not a passive piece waiting to be activated later. It is part of the defensive and counter-attacking machinery from an early stage, and removing it or neutralizing it is one of the attacker's real objectives, not just a side effect of other plans. Black's knights typically go to f6 and d7. The knight on f6 is a key defender of the king side, and a piece that contests the d5 square. The queen often sits on c7 or b6, keeping pressure on the center and the queen side. Black frequently delays castling, keeping the king flexible between both sides of the board. That flexibility is not a weakness. It is a feature. It means the attacker cannot simply commit to a kingside attack and assume the king will be there. The attacker's paradox in the Najdorf is this: pressing forward often creates the very looseness that Black's counterplay exploits. If White advances pawns on the king side without controlling Black's queenside resources, Black's b5 advance, or a central d5 push, can generate enough activity to equalize or more. The attacker is not looking for a weakness in the usual sense. The position has no obvious structural hole to target. The challenge is managing tempo and initiative carefully enough to press without overextending. A common mistake at the club level is launching a kingside pawn storm before Black's queenside counterplay has been addressed. The result is that Black can often ignore the kingside threats and generate their own attack faster. The Najdorf is not simply an aggressive opening for Black. When the attacker fails to control the pace, it becomes a deeply resilient defensive system, where black's activity does the work of a structural wall without ever needing one. The dragon works differently. Where the Najdorf's resilience is distributed across piece activity and pawn threats, the dragon's resilience is concentrated in one piece, the bishop on g7. That bishop, fianchettoed behind a pawn on g6, controls the long diagonal from h8 all the way to a1. It defends the king. It pressures central squares like e5 and d4. And it aims toward the queenside, exerting long-range pressure that becomes increasingly dangerous as the position simplifies. The dragon pawn structure typically has black's pawns on c5, d6, and g6, with the half-open d-file and the c-file giving black natural avenues for rook activity. Black's king sits on g8 behind the fianchetto. Rooks often go to c8 and either e8 or d8, and the knights occupy f6 and c6. The queen can go to a5, c7, or b6, often coordinating with the c-file rooks to generate pressure against white's queenside. What makes the dragon fortress-like is the endgame dimension. If black survives the middle game attack and reaches an endgame with the g7 bishop intact, that bishop's control of the long diagonal becomes a permanent resource. Dragon endgames with an active bishop, rooks on the c-file, and a solid pawn structure around the king are genuinely difficult to crack. The bishop does not diminish in value as pieces come off the board. In many cases it increases. That endgame threat is itself a defensive weapon in the middle game. The attacker must either destroy the g7 bishop or prevent the position from converting into that endgame. This creates a specific obligation. The attack must be direct, and it must be decisive. Delay does not favor white the way it might in other positions. The longer the dragon bishop sits on g7 uncontested, the more dangerous the endgame becomes. This is the structural contrast between the two variations. The Najdorf tends to reward positional restraint and careful management of tempo. The dragon tends to reward direct, often sacrificial play aimed at one specific target. Applying the wrong approach to either variation is a common path to losing the initiative. For the Najdorf, the attacker's primary structural goal is controlling the d5 square. Establishing a knight on d5 or creating a pawn on d5 to restrict black's pieces removes black's most reliable route to central counterplay. When d5 is firmly in white's hands, the position becomes slower and more positional, and white's space advantage can be converted without the constant threat of black equalizing through a central break. The d6 pawn becomes a target, and white can build pressure along the d-file and aim at the kingside dark squares, particularly f5 and g6. The piece exchange strategy in the Najdorf follows from this. Removing black's most active defenders reduces the counterplay options directly. The knight on f6 is a priority target because it defends the kingside and contests d5 simultaneously. The queen's bishop, when it is active, is another piece worth trading away because it contributes to black's counterplay generation. Each exchange that removes an active black piece makes it harder for black to generate the threats that give the Najdorf its fortress character. The dragon requires a different toolkit entirely. The standard breaking mechanism is the pawn storm, with g4 and g5, aiming to challenge the kingside and open lines against black's king. This advance is most effective when white has castled queenside. Development is complete, and pieces are aimed at h5 and g6. The g4 to g5 push is often accompanied by h4 and h5 to open both the g-file and the h-file simultaneously. The goal is not to win material. The goal is to open lines fast enough to reach the king before black's c-file counterplay becomes decisive. When the pawn storm alone is insufficient, piece sacrifices become the mechanism. A sacrifice on h6 can destroy the pawn cover around the king, or eliminate a key defensive piece. Exchange sacrifices on c3 are a well-known theme in dragon positions, typically used by black to eliminate white's knight and disrupt white's defensive setup, while sacrifices aimed at d5 can be used by either side to alter the central pawn balance before counterplay becomes overwhelming. These sacrifices are not about material gain. They are about destroying the opponent's setup, which is the same principle that applies to breaking any fortress anchor. The common confusion is treating the dragon the way you would treat a Najdorf. Slow maneuvering plans that resemble Najdorf-style positional restraint give black time to activate the c-file, consolidate the bishop's diagonal, and convert the position toward the endgame, where the bishop is strongest. Against the dragon, when white delays the pawn storm significantly in favor of minor piece regrouping, black's counterplay often becomes sufficient to equalize or more. The Kasparov versus Topalov game from Wykensee in 1999 is one of the most analyzed games in modern chess, and it illustrates the core principle of this chapter with unusual clarity. The game arose from a Sicilian Najdorf, and the reason it gets cited so often in training literature is not any single move, but the sustained decision-making across the middle game. Kasparov built pressure through a sequence of piece activity and pawn advances, and the critical moment came when he assessed that the time for direct action had arrived, rather than further maneuvering. The game is famous for a series of rook maneuvers and piece sacrifices that dismantled black's defensive setup systematically. Kasparov gave up material at several points, not to win it back immediately, but to eliminate the pieces anchoring black's position and open lines that could not be closed again. Each sacrifice removed a defender or exposed a weakness, and the cumulative effect was a position where black's structure became impossible to hold, despite the material imbalance. The specific moves are worth studying in full, but the instructive element is the underlying logic. Kasparov identified which pieces were doing the defensive work and removed them in sequence. The lesson is not about the specific sacrifice. The lesson is about the window. In Najdorf positions, the gap between the moment black's counterplay is neutralized and the moment black reorganizes to generate new threats is narrow. Recognizing that window and committing to a breakthrough immediately, rather than continuing to maneuver, is the skill the position demands. Kasparov saw the window and acted. That sequence of recognition and commitment, not the calculation alone, is what makes the game instructive. Chapter 6: The Hedgehog and Hypermodern Defensive Shells. The defensive structures covered so far have one thing in common. Whether it is the French wall, the Caro-Kann blockade, or the Sicilian dragon's g7 bishop, each structure contests something directly. The French pawn chain pushes back against white's center. The dragon bishop fires down the long diagonal. Even when the defender is cramped, there is a visible point of resistance. The hedgehog does something fundamentally different. It does not push back. It absorbs. That distinction is worth sitting with before anything else, because it changes what the attacker is actually facing. In the hedgehog, black's pawns sit on the 6th rank. The characteristic shell places pawns on a6, b6, d6, and e6, with a pawn on c5, completing the Queenside formation. Nothing is pushed forward. Nothing is contesting space. White can advance pawns to the 4th and 5th ranks without immediate resistance, and the natural instinct is to read that as success. The center looks controlled. The Queenside looks dominated. The position looks won. That reading is exactly what the hedgehog is designed to produce. because the moment white overcommits to that space, the structure snaps back. This is what separates an elastic defense from a rigid one. Unlike the French pawn chain, which holds a fixed shape, an elastic defense has no fixed breaking point. It bends. It stores the attacker's energy and returns it. The hedgehog's pawns on the 6th rank are not a wall. They are a coiled spring, and the coil tightens every time white pushes another pawn forward, without a concrete plan to prevent the release. The release comes from pawn breaks. Black's primary threats are the b5 advance on the queenside and the d5 push in the center. Neither of these is immediately available when the hedgehog shell is first set up. Black needs preparation. The b5 break typically requires the dark squared bishop developed to b7, rooks coordinated on b8 and c8, and the queen on c7 adding pressure toward the center. The d5 break needs similar coordination, with rooks on c8 and d8, and the knight on f6 ready to recapture on d5, while the b7 bishop increases pressure on the e4 pawn once the center opens. When all of that is in place, a single pawn push can unravel an entire structure that looked dominant a move earlier. The cramped side accumulating energy is the core idea here, and it is the one that most attackers resist intuitively. Cramped positions look passive. They look like suffering. In static defensive structures, that reading is often correct. A defender in a French position who cannot activate the light-squared bishop is genuinely suffering. But in the hedgehog, the cramped side is not passive. It is loaded. Every piece has a specific role in preparing one of the two breaks. The knights sit on d7 and f6, with d7 serving as a rerouting square towards c5 or e5. The bishops cover b7 and e7. The rooks line up behind the b and c files. The queen coordinates from c7. None of this looks threatening in isolation. Together, it is a mechanism waiting for the right moment to fire. The attacker's danger is not recognizing that mechanism until it is too late. Overextension against the hedgehog is not a single mistake. It is a gradual process where each individual pawn advance looks reasonable, and the structural problem only becomes visible once several advances have been made together. White pushes pawns to c4 and e4. That looks like a space advantage. Then a4 and b4 come, trying to suppress the queenside. That appears to secure dominance on that flank. Then perhaps f4 and g4, aiming at the kingside. Each move has local justification. But the cumulative picture is a set of pawns on the 4th and 5th ranks, with few defenders left behind them, and black's pawn shell still intact on the 6th rank, with both breaks fully prepared. The specific moment of danger is when white's queenside pawns have advanced to a4 and b4, while black still has pawns on a6 and b6 ready to undermine them. A b5 break in that position does not just open a file. It creates a weak c4 pawn that black's pieces can target, weakens the a2 and b2 squares, and potentially gives black a passed pawn or an open file into white's position. The advance that looked like queenside control has become a liability. The same logic applies on the other side of the board. Pushing f4 and g4 without a concrete attacking plan leaves squares like e4, f5, and h4 exposed to black's pieces once a central break opens the position. The e4-e5 advance is a particularly common mistake at the club level. It looks aggressive. It drives black's knight from f6. But if the advance is not properly prepared, the knight simply relocates to d5 or f5 with gain of tempo, landing on a strong central square that it would not have reached without white's help. Similarly, pushing c4-c5 prematurely can fix black's d6 pawn as a target, but it simultaneously hands black the d5 square as a permanent outpost for pieces, and it reduces white's own flexibility on the queen side. The habit to build here is checking, before any pawn advance, whether that advance creates a new weakness in white's own structure that black's prepared breaks can exploit. The attacker's pawns are not just weapons in this structure. They are potential targets, and they become targets the moment they move beyond their support network. Once overextension is understood as the primary danger, the correct method against the hedgehog follows naturally. The goal is not to open the position. It is to close it down in a way that removes black's ability to use the breaks at all. Strategic strangulation against the hedgehog means controlling the break squares before black can use them, improving pieces gradually to their best possible posts, and forcing black into a position where the elastic snapback is structurally unavailable. This is a different internal tempo than attacking a rigid fortress. Against a French wall, the attacker is looking for a lever that opens a line and creates immediate entry points. Against the hedgehog, the attacker is looking to neutralize the defender's dynamic potential before it can be realized. The position should become quieter, not more explosive. Controlling the queenside break requires attention to the b5 square itself and the surrounding squares at a5 and c5. A pawn on a4 combined with a piece targeting b5 from c3 or d4 can make the break structurally unavailable. A rook on b1 adds another layer, because if black plays b5 and the b-file opens, white's rook is already there. Controlling the central push requires pressure on the d6 pawn, and pieces positioned to exploit the center if it opens. Doubling rooks on the d-file, placing a knight on d5 via c3 or e3, and using a fianchettoed bishop on g2 to monitor the long diagonal toward b7 and d5 are all documented methods for keeping the central break suppressed. The piece improvement principle matters here more than in most structures. The recommendation in strategy literature is to identify white's worst-placed piece and reroute it before committing any pawn advances. A knight that has drifted to a passive square can be rerouted through a long maneuver, something like b1 to d2 to f1 to e3 or g3, and that slow repositioning is more valuable than a premature pawn push. A queen moved from d1 to e2 or c2 supports central squares and prepares for potential sacrifices if black forces the d5 break anyway. A rook transferred from a1 to d1 and then to d3 adds pressure to the d-file without committing any pawns. Exchanges are also part of the strangulation plan. Trading black's b7 bishop removes the long diagonal pressure that makes both breaks dangerous. That bishop is doing significant work, covering d5 and e4, and supporting the b5 advance. Without it, black's coordination weakens. Removing black's knight from f6, either by pushing e4-e5 at the right moment, or by a knight on d5 capturing it, reduces black's ability to support the d5 break and softens the king side. Exchanging one of black's rooks, particularly the c8 rook, reduces the tactical resources available for both the c-file and future break preparation. In some positions, exchanging queens voluntarily is correct, leaving black with a cramped structure and no dynamic possibilities to compensate for the space deficit. The question to ask before each move in a hedgehog position is precise. Does this move control a break square, improve a piece toward a better post, or target a specific piece in black's coordination? If the answer is no, and the move is instead a pawn advance looking for activity, it is worth pausing. The hedgehog punishes that kind of impatience more consistently than most structures, because the punishment is not a tactical refutation. It is a structural reversal, where the attacker's apparent strength becomes the source of the problem. Different defensive structures demand different attacking tempos. The French wall invites a lever at the right moment. The hedgehog demands patience and restriction first, and the attacker who applies French-style aggression to a hedgehog setup will find that the energy they put into the position comes back at them. Chapter 7. The Slav and Semi-Slav Defensive Structures. The Slav and Semi-Slav are built on a different philosophy than the hypermodern setups covered earlier. The hedgehog and similar structures invite overextension, then spring back. The Slav does not wait for the attacker to overreach. It controls the center directly, maintains piece flexibility, and forces the attacker to solve a structural problem rather than simply avoid a trap. The defensive logic here is not reactive, it is architectural. Understanding that distinction is the starting point for everything in this chapter. 3 questions shape everything that follows. What makes the Slav's pawn configuration structurally distinct? How the Semi-Slav adds a layer of complexity that changes the attacking problem, and why piece coordination, rather than direct pawn attacks, is the correct way to generate real pressure against either structure. Each of these connects to the next, so the reasoning builds as you go. Start with the pawn structure itself, because that is where the slave's identity lives. Black's 2 defining pawns are on c6 and d5. The d5 pawn stakes a claim in the center. The c6 pawn guards it. Together they form a central duo that controls the e4 square from Black's side and gives the entire structure its stability. What makes this different from other queen's pawn defenses is not merely the control those pawns provide. The c6 pawn also leaves the c8 bishop's diagonal open. In the queen's gambit declined, Black plays e6 early. That pawn shores up d5, just as c6 does in the Slav, but it closes the diagonal that the c8 bishop needs to develop. The bishop gets hemmed in behind its own pawns, often for many moves, and that restriction creates a persistent imbalance that White can exploit. The Slav sidesteps that problem entirely. Because c6, rather than e6, is doing the supporting work, the c8 bishop has the option to develop to f5 before any e6 advance closes the diagonal. The g4 square is also theoretically available, though f5 is the more common and structurally motivated choice. That is a meaningful structural advantage, and it is not accidental. It is the whole point of the c6-d5 configuration. The consequence for the attacker is direct. In a queen's gambit declined structure, White can often count on the c8 bishop being a long-term liability. In the Slav, that assumption is wrong. Black's pieces are coordinated from the start, and the attacker who treats the Slav as a passive setup will find that the defender's pieces are active and well placed before any real pressure has been generated. The other thing the c6-d5 duo does is limit White's central expansion. When Black has played e6 instead of c6, White sometimes has room to push e4 and claim a space advantage in the center. Against the Slav's c6-d5 structure, that advance is harder to achieve because d5 is more securely held. The c6 pawn supports d5 without creating the kind of light square weaknesses on the queen side that can arise in other setups, though White retains the option of preparing e4 through moves like nc3, e3, and bd3 in certain lines. The structure is not just solid in the sense of being hard to crack. It is solid in the sense of being well engineered. Every pawn is doing a specific job, and the jobs are coordinated. This is the correction to the most common misreading of the Slav. Solidity is not passivity. The c6-d5 formation controls key central squares, keeps the bishop active, limits White's expansion options, and does all of this while avoiding the typical pawn weaknesses like isolated or doubled pawns that give attackers something concrete to target. The structure is not waiting to be attacked. It is already doing work. Now add the e6 pawn, and the structure becomes the Semi-Slav. Black now has pawns on c6, d5, and e6, forming a triangle in the center. That triangle is more compact than the pure Slav. It is harder to break with a single pawn lever, because the three pawns support each other from multiple directions. But the addition of e6 comes with a cost. The c8 bishop, which was free to develop early in the pure Slav, is now locked behind the e6 pawn. Black has traded bishop activity for structural solidity. That trade is not necessarily bad. It depends entirely on what Black does with the position next. But it changes the defensive character in an important way. The Semi-Slav presents a unique structural challenge, and the attacker needs to read it differently. The key feature of the Semi-Slav triangle is that it cannot stay in its original form indefinitely. At some point, pawn tension in the center will be resolved. Either the c6-d5 tension will break, or the e6-d5 tension will break, and each resolution produces a different kind of position. If the d-pawn advances or is exchanged, the structure opens in one direction. If the c-pawn moves or is traded, it opens in another. Each of those openings changes which pieces become active, which squares become available, and which plans become viable for both sides. This is what makes the Semi-Slav structurally more complex than the pure Slav. The triangle contains multiple potential resolutions, and the character of the middle game depends on which one occurs first. The attacker who commits to a plan without identifying which tension is about to resolve will often find that the position has transformed in a direction that does not suit the pieces they have developed. The concrete skill here is learning to read which tension is closest to breaking before choosing an attacking setup. White's pressure against the Semi-Slav triangle typically targets that central tension before Black has resolved it, on Black's own terms. The reason is straightforward. If Black gets to choose when and how the center opens, Black's pieces will be coordinated for whatever structure results. If White can force the resolution, or at least anticipate it, the attacker can have pieces already aimed at the squares that will matter in the resulting position. This is a decision point, not just a positional observation. Before committing to any piece arrangement against the Semi-Slav, the question to ask is which pawn tension is going to break, and which direction it will break in. That question shapes everything that follows. With that structural understanding in place, the question becomes how to actually generate pressure against these formations. And the answer is not what many attackers expect. Direct pawn attacks against the Slav and Semi-Slav structures typically fail. The defensive pawn chain is too well supported, and the attacker who tries to storm it with pawns alone will usually find that the advances either stall out or create weaknesses in the attacker's own position. The correct approach is piece coordination, and specifically the creation of outpost squares that the defender cannot easily contest. An outpost is a square where a piece, almost always a knight, can be placed with no pawn available to dislodge it. In Slav and Semi-Slav positions, the two most important outpost squares for White are c5 and e5. The c5 outpost becomes available when Black's d-pawn no longer controls that square, and Black has no convenient pawn advance to challenge a piece placed there. Typically this arises after an exchange on c5, or after the d5 pawn has moved or been traded, leaving the square without pawn coverage. A knight on c5 sits in front of Black's queenside, restricts Black's piece activity, and often targets weak pawns or squares deeper in Black's position. It becomes a lasting asset, precisely because the defender cannot simply push a pawn to evict it. The only responses available are to exchange the knight, challenge the pawn that supports it, or try to block the entry square, and each of those responses has its own structural cost. The e5 outpost works on the same logic, but on the king side. When black's central pawns do not control e5, and white can support a knight there, with pieces rather than pawns, that knight becomes a platform for king-side pressure. It restricts black's defensive pieces, controls key squares around the king, and forces the defender to address a problem that cannot be solved by simply waiting. What makes outpost play the right method against these structures is that it creates an imbalance the defender cannot ignore. A well-placed knight on c5 or e5 is not just a positional annoyance. It is a piece doing real work, controlling multiple strategic points simultaneously. The defender has to respond, and every response involves a structural concession of some kind. The connection to the earlier framework is direct. An outpost knight functions as the attacker's equivalent of a load-bearing anchor. It holds the pressure together, controls multiple strategic points, and forces the defender into concessions. The structural hole that makes the outpost possible is the latent entry point that pre-move analysis is designed to find. In Slav and semi-Slav positions, that analysis is not optional preparation. It is what separates a plan from a guess. The habit this chapter trains is evaluating pawn tension before initiating any piece exchange. In Slav and semi-Slav positions, every exchange has structural consequences. A trade that looks simplifying might be resolving a tension in the defender's favor, opening squares for black's pieces, or destroying an outpost the attacker was building toward. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for effective play in these positions. Chapter 8: Queenside Fortress Structures and the Nimzo-Queen's Indian Complex. The Slav and semi-Slav positions examined before this point share one defining quality. Their resistance is carried by pawns. The pawn structure itself is doing the defensive work, and the attacker's job is to find the lever that cracks it. That logic does not transfer to every defensive system. The Nimzo-Indian and Queen's Indian setups operate on a different principle entirely, and applying pawn lever thinking to them produces systematic errors. Understanding why requires stepping back and looking at what is actually holding the defense together. A pawn-anchored defense draws its resilience from a stable pawn skeleton, fixed points, closed lines, denied squares, and weaknesses that are permanent once created. A piece-based defense has no equivalent skeleton to crack. The defense holds because certain pieces are doing specific jobs, and if those pieces are removed or forced onto inferior squares, the structure collapses without any pawn having been touched. This distinction matters enormously for how you approach the position. Against a pawn-anchored defense, you are looking for the right lever at the right moment. Against a piece-based defense, you are looking for the right exchange at the right moment. These are distinct challenges, and confusing them is among the more consequential systematic errors in attacking play. The Nimzo-Indian is the clearest example of a piece-based defense. Black places a bishop on b4, pinning white's knight on c3. That pin is not decorative. The c3 knight is the piece white would normally use to support a central pawn duo on d4 and e4. With the knight pinned, white's central expansion plan is disrupted before it begins. The bishop on b4 is not attacking a pawn. It is attacking a plan. This is the defining quality of piece-based defensive logic. The resistance is directed at the opponent's intentions, not at a fixed structural feature. For the attacker, every exchange decision carries structural weight. In a pawn-anchored defense, an exchange between pieces might simplify the position, without changing the underlying skeleton. In a piece-based defense, an exchange between pieces can transform the entire character of the position. When black's bishop on b4 leaves the board, the defense does not simply lose one piece. It changes form. The question of whether that change favors the attacker or the defender depends entirely on what follows. A common mistake is to treat piece-based defenses as weaker than pawn-based ones, on the grounds that pieces can be traded away while pawns are harder to eliminate. That reasoning is backwards. Piece-based defenses are not weaker. They are different. A pawn weakness is permanent once created. A piece-based defense can reorganize, find new coordination, and generate pressure along new lines. Underestimating a piece-based defense, because there is no fixed pawn target, can lead to being outplayed by a defense that has no obvious weakness and does not need one. Moving into the Queen's Indian structure makes the concept of piece-based defense even more precise. Here, black fianchettos a bishop to b7, aiming it along the long diagonal from a8 to h1. The purpose of this bishop is not to defend a pawn. It is to contest the center before white can occupy it. Specifically, the b7 bishop exerts pressure on the e4 square, making it difficult for white to establish a central pawn duo. This is a prophylactic defense, meaning it prevents a threat rather than responding to one. Black is not reacting to white's e4 advance. Black is making that advance structurally costly before it happens. The logic here requires thinking one step ahead of what is visible on the board. In pawn terms, black's position looks modest. There is no imposing pawn chain, no fixed central pawn. The resistance is invisible, unless you are tracking piece lines. The b7 bishop combined with a knight on d5 or e4 creates a piece-based barrier against central expansion that has no pawn equivalent. Misjudging the board by seeing no pawn obstacle can lead to overlooking the true challenge, the diagonal, which is controlled by a piece. White has documented ways to contest this. One is to establish a bishop on b2, placing it on the same long diagonal and creating a direct battle of fianchettoed bishops. Another is to play d5 at an appropriate moment, closing the diagonal entirely and limiting the b7 bishop's scope. A third is to exchange a piece that is blocking the diagonal, which can sometimes strengthen black's control by removing the obstruction, or weaken it by removing a supporting piece. The choice between these approaches depends on the specific position, but the underlying question is always the same. How do you neutralize the diagonal control without creating new problems elsewhere? The transferable principle is this. Any time a bishop controls a long diagonal, that diagonal must be accounted for before central pawns are pushed. Pushing into a controlled diagonal without a plan for neutralizing it is not aggressive play. It is an error in positional judgment. The diagonal is a load-bearing feature of the defense, in the same sense that a fixed pawn chain is a load-bearing feature of a pawn-anchored defense. You do not ignore it and hope for the best. This brings the focus to the specific attacking technique that works against piece-based defenses. A direct assault does not function here because there is no fixed target to assault. The correct method is to provoke exchanges that leave the defender with passive pieces or a weakened pawn structure. The goal is not to destroy the defense with force. It is to engineer a situation where the defender's key pieces are forced to make choices between bad and worse. In Nimzo-Indian positions, the standard technique for provoking the critical exchange is to play a3, directly attacking the b4 bishop and forcing a decision. Black must either capture on c3 or retreat the bishop. Each outcome serves the attacker differently, and understanding both outcomes before playing a3 is essential. If black captures on c3, white recaptures with either the b pawn or the d pawn, creating doubled pawns on the c file. The doubled c pawns are a structural concession, but they come with compensation. White gains the bishop pair. The c3 pawn can become a long-term weakness that black targets, but the semi-open b file and the extra central pawn mass can support a later central advance if white opens the position correctly. White's knight, which can no longer return to c3, must find alternative routes, most commonly through e2, and then toward d4 or f4, or via a4 toward b6 or c5. The correct follow-up for white is to use the bishop pair actively, opening the position with breaks like e4 or c4 to create diagonals for both bishops, and contesting the b file with rooks to counter black's pressure along that half-open file. Accepting doubled pawns and then playing passively wastes the compensation. The bishop pair requires open lines to function. If black retreats the bishop instead of exchanging it, a different imbalance arises. Black keeps a strong bishop, but concedes time and allows white to consolidate the center. The defense has not been dismantled, but it has been made slightly passive. White uses the gained tempo to complete development and prepare central expansions. Moves like QB3 and RB1 increase piece activity on the Queenside and exploit black's slightly passive piece placement. The bishop retreat is not a defeat for black, but it shifts the character of the position in white's favor if white responds accurately. The critical habit here is evaluating both outcomes before provoking the decision. Playing a 3 without knowing what you will do after the exchange, and without knowing what you will do after the retreat, is not attacking. It is hoping. Having a concrete follow-up for each branch is essential, because the defense will choose whichever branch is more uncomfortable for the attacker, not for the defender. The broader principle this establishes is that against piece-based defenses, the attacker's leverage comes from forcing the defender's key pieces to choose between bad and worse. The b4 bishop must either exchange itself and create structural consequences, or retreat and concede time. The b7 bishop must either watch its diagonal get closed or find a new role in a transformed position. In both cases, the attacker is not destroying the defense directly. The attacker is making the defense expensive to maintain. Shifting from seeking a target to attack towards seeking a decision to force is what separates effective attacking play against piece-based defenses from the pawn-lever thinking that works in structurally different systems. Before committing to any exchange or advance against a piece-based defense, evaluate the role of each defensive piece. Consider what job that piece is doing. Determine what happens to the defense if that piece is removed or displaced. Identify which exchanges leave the defender's remaining pieces on worse squares than the attacker's. These questions replace the pawn-lever diagnostic that applies to structurally anchored defenses. The answers determine the correct attacking method, and getting the method right depends entirely on correctly identifying what kind of defense you are facing before you begin. Chapter 9. Pawn structure weaknesses inside defensive fortresses. Pawn structure forms the backbone of every defensive system, providing the foundation upon which both piece-based and pawn-anchored defenses rely. Even when pieces appear to be doing most of the work, the underlying structure is crucial. A fortress that seems solid from the outside may hide internal structural faults that no amount of piece activity can permanently conceal. Before any attacking method can be chosen, those faults need to be located and understood. The most common and instructive of them is the backward pawn. The backward pawn is fixed in place by opposing pawns on adjacent files that control the square it would need to advance through. Advancing it would either hand the opponent a capture or allow them to occupy the vacated square with a piece that cannot easily be driven away. When both of those conditions are true, the pawn is genuinely backward, not just temporarily misplaced. The distinction matters because not every pawn that looks backward actually is. A pawn that has lagged behind for a few moves, but can be supported by a neighboring pawn advance, or can safely step forward and trade off with an opposing pawn, is only temporarily behind. It is not a structural weakness in any meaningful sense. The attacker who commits serious resources to pressuring a temporarily misplaced pawn is likely to find that the defender resolves the situation with a single pawn break, and the pressure evaporates. The habit to build is checking whether the pawn's backward status is permanent before treating it as a target. What locks a backward pawn in place is the presence of opposing pawns on the adjacent files. Those pawns sit one rank ahead and control the squares the backward pawn would need to advance through. If the backward pawn tries to step forward, it walks into a capture or into a square that is firmly controlled by the opponent. The defending side cannot use their own neighboring pawns to support the advance either, because those pawns are already ahead of the backward pawn and cannot step backward to help. The pawn is caught between its own advanced neighbors and the opponent's controlling pawns on the files beside it. That combination is what makes it fixed. This is also where the backward pawn gets confused with the isolated pawn, and the confusion leads to different mistakes depending on which side you are on. An isolated pawn has no friendly pawns on either adjacent file at all. It is alone and must be defended entirely by pieces. A backward pawn, by contrast, does have friendly pawns on the adjacent files. They are simply ahead of it. The backward pawn is not isolated from its neighbors in terms of their existence on the board. It is isolated from their support because of where they are standing. The practical consequence is different. An isolated pawn is a target that can sometimes become a strength if it controls important squares. A backward pawn creates a specific square problem directly in front of it, which is the more important structural feature to understand. The square directly in front of a backward pawn cannot be defended by a pawn. The backward pawn itself cannot step forward to challenge a piece sitting there. The neighboring pawns are already past that square and cannot come back to protect it. That means any piece the attacker places on that square is immune to being driven away by a pawn move. Only other pieces can challenge it. In a closed position, where piece activity is often restricted and exchanges are difficult to force, a square that is permanently immune to pawn challenges is enormously valuable. A knight placed there has a stable base from which it can coordinate with other pieces, apply pressure to the backward pawn directly below it, and restrict the defender's ability to organize pawn breaks in that area of the board. The square in front of a backward pawn is an outpost in the most structurally guaranteed sense. It exists not because the attacker created it through clever maneuvering, but because the pawn structure itself guarantees it. As long as the backward pawn remains fixed, the square in front of it remains available. The attacker does not need to maintain the outpost through constant vigilance. The structure maintains it automatically. The backward pawn also tends to sit on a half-open file. Because the pawn has not advanced, the file in front of it is unobstructed on the attacker's side. That means rooks and the queen can be brought to bear on the pawn directly. The pawn must then be defended by pieces rather than by other pawns, which places a continuous burden on the defender's piece coordination. Every piece assigned to guard the backward pawn is a piece that cannot participate in counterplay elsewhere. When the defender's pieces are already stretched across multiple defensive duties, adding the backward pawn to the list of things they must protect can produce an overloaded piece, with one defender responsible for more critical squares than it can reliably cover. The structures where backward pawns appear most often in practice are worth recognizing as patterns. In Sicilian formations, black's pawn on d6 frequently lags behind the pawns on c5 and e5, or e6, and if white controls the d5 square, that pawn can become fixed. In French-type structures, black's pawn on e6 can become a long-term liability in closed central formations, where advancing it creates new problems rather than solving old ones. In closed queen's pawn games, backward pawns appear on the c-file or e-file after exchanges strand one pawn behind its neighbors. In king's Indian pawn chains, the pawn on d6 or e5 can lag behind and lose its supporting break. These are not isolated accidents. They are recurring structural outcomes of specific pawn exchanges, and recognizing the exchange that creates the backward pawn is as important as recognizing the backward pawn itself. The exchange pattern that typically produces a backward pawn involves one side capturing toward the center and the other recapturing with a piece, rather than a pawn. The recapturing side avoids doubling pawns or maintains piece activity, but the cost is that one pawn is now left behind its neighbors with no immediate way to catch up. The backward pawn is the structural price paid for that decision. Whether the price is worth it depends on what the recapturing side gained in compensation, but the structural liability is real and needs to be evaluated honestly. When assessing whether a backward pawn is worth attacking, a few practical conditions determine whether the pressure will be effective. The pawn needs to be genuinely fixed, not just temporarily behind. It should sit on a half-open file where heavy pieces can be brought against it. The square in front of it should be occupable by an attacking piece without being easily exchanged off. The defending side's pieces should already have other responsibilities, so that guarding the backward pawn adds to an existing burden, rather than being the only task they face. And critically, the pressure on the backward pawn should not inadvertently open lines that give the defender active counterplay. A backward pawn that becomes a hook for the defender to generate activity is a liability for the attacker, not the defender. If the defender can organize a pawn break that eliminates the backward pawn's fixed status, the entire structural argument dissolves. The attacker needs to evaluate whether that break is genuinely available or whether it can be prevented. The principle is well established in positional chess theory. The value of a backward pawn as a target depends entirely on whether the defender can free it. Aaron Nimzovich, whose systematic work on pawn weaknesses in My System remains foundational in chess instruction, gave particular weight to this diagnostic, arguing that restraining the freeing break was the attacker's primary task once a backward pawn was identified. Preventing that freeing break, or recognizing that it cannot be prevented, and therefore the pawn is only temporarily weak, is the diagnostic skill that separates purposeful pressure from wasted effort. Reading a pawn structure for backward pawns is not about cataloging every pawn on the board. It is about locating the fixed points, the squares where the structure has created a permanent problem that piece activity alone cannot solve. A backward pawn is one such fixed point. The square in front of it is another. Together they form a structural complex that the attacker can return to again and again, because the structure itself keeps regenerating the weakness. This enduring pattern of backward pawns highlights their significance, inviting deeper understanding beyond mere position-specific details. Chapter 10. Piece Maneuvering to Exploit Fortress Weaknesses. Identifying a weakness in a fortress structure is one skill. Getting a piece onto a square where it actually applies pressure to that weakness is a different skill entirely. Most attacking plans break down in the gap between those two steps. The diagnosis was correct. The target was real, but the pieces never arrived in the right order, or they arrived on squares that looked active, but accomplished nothing concrete. This chapter is about closing that gap. The tool that closes it most reliably, especially against backward pawns and the pawn-immune squares they create, is the outpost knight. A knight outpost is a square where the knight cannot be driven away by any enemy pawn. No pawn can advance to attack it. That stability is what makes the outpost knight different from any other piece sitting on an active square. A bishop can be challenged by a pawn advance. A rook can be contested by another rook. A queen can be harassed off a good square. A knight on a true outpost just stays there. The defender has to use pieces to deal with it, and that is exactly the problem the attacker wants to create. The square directly in front of a backward pawn is the clearest example of a natural outpost. No pawn can ever advance to challenge a piece sitting there. The attacker knows this, and the defender knows this, which means the defender will try to prevent the knight from reaching that square in the first place. That is why the route to the outpost matters as much as the outpost itself. Knight routes are almost never direct. A knight sitting on its starting square cannot simply jump to a deep outpost in one move. It needs 2 or 3 preparatory moves, often stepping through intermediate squares that may look passive or even awkward. The key is to plan the full route before beginning it, because each intermediate square must be safe and must not create a new weakness in your own position. A knight routed from a back rank square to a central outpost via an intermediate square may require 2 or more moves, and each step needs to be evaluated before the first one is played. Once the knight reaches the outpost, its effect on the defender is not just positional pressure on the backward pawn. It also restricts the defender's bishop. A knight planted on a strong central square controls squares on the bishop's diagonals, limiting where the bishop can safely go. This is the imbalance that makes the knight versus bad bishop scenario so recurring in fortress-breaking positions. The defender's bishop is already restricted by its own pawns, sitting on the same color complex. The knight on the outpost compounds that restriction by controlling additional squares the bishop might have used. The bishop ends up with very little to do, while the knight is doing a great deal. There is a common assumption that a knight on the edge of the board is poorly placed. The old saying exists for a reason, but it does not apply when the edge square is a genuine outpost adjacent to a structural weakness. A knight anchored on a rim square next to a backward pawn can be just as dominant as one in the center, because what matters is not the square's geometry, but its stability and its relationship to the weakness it is pressuring. If no pawn can challenge it, and it restricts the defender's pieces, the knight is doing its job. The defender's options against a well-placed outpost knight are limited, and all come with costs. Advancing a pawn to challenge the knight is the most direct method, but that pawn advance often creates a new weakness, or opens a line the attacker can use. Exchanging a bishop or another minor piece for the knight removes the outpost, but it also removes one of the defender's active pieces, and the structural weakness the knight was pressuring does not go away just because the knight is gone. Attacking the knight with a rook or queen rarely dislodges it on its own. A rook or queen bearing down on a knight does not force it to move unless the attack is supported by additional pieces or the knight has no safe retreat square. The knight simply stays, and the rook or queen is committed to a defensive function rather than an active one. That last point is worth holding on to. A knight on an outpost does not just pressure a pawn. It forces the defender to assign pieces to dealing with it, which means those pieces are not available for anything else. This constraint on the defender's resources allows the attacker greater freedom of action on other parts of the board. Rooks become the natural complement to this pressure once the outpost knight is established. A rook on a closed file contributes very little. Before rooks can participate in the attack, a file needs to be opened, and that process is patient and sequential. A pawn exchange on the target file removes the blocking pawn and gives the rook a path forward. Sometimes a pawn advance provokes the exchange rather than executing it directly, but the goal is the same: clear the file so the rook can enter. Doubling rooks on an open file concentrates pressure and controls the entry squares on that file. The distinction worth understanding is that doubling rooks does not automatically create an immediate threat. It creates an immediate threat only when the file leads to a concrete target, such as the backward pawn itself or a square behind it. When no immediate target is available, doubling rooks still improves coordination and prepares future entry, but it should not be confused with an active threat. The defender who sees doubled rooks and panics may make unnecessary concessions. The attacker who doubles rooks and waits for a concrete target is thinking correctly. The most powerful rook position in most fortress-breaking scenarios is the 7th rank. A rook that penetrates to the 7th rank attacks pawns that have not yet been advanced and simultaneously cuts off the defending king's movement along that rank. That combination of functions, attacking material while restricting the king, makes a 7th rank rook extremely difficult to neutralize. The defender cannot simply trade it off unless the exchange is available on the file, and blocking the entry square with a piece only works until that piece becomes overloaded or pinned. A rook that reaches the 7th rank behind a pawn weakness is not just applying pressure. It is doing two jobs at once, and the defender has to find answers to both. Bishops operate differently, but create a related kind of problem. A bishop applying pressure from a long diagonal does not need to capture anything immediately to be effective. The latent threat consumes the defender's attention. The defender has to monitor the diagonal constantly, which limits the options available for active play. That constraint is the bishop's contribution, even in positions where no capture is imminent. The good bishop versus bad bishop imbalance is the structural version of this pressure. When the attacker's bishop operates on a color opposite to the defender's central pawns, it attacks those pawns from a diagonal the defender's own bishop cannot contest. The defender's bishop is locked behind pawns on its own color complex, unable to challenge the attacker's diagonal. This is rarely a subtle advantage. It tends to be a structural mismatch that compounds as the position opens, because the attacker's bishop gains scope while the defender's bishop stays restricted. Repositioning a bishop to a more active diagonal usually requires a preparatory pawn move. That pawn move needs to be evaluated carefully, because opening a diagonal for your bishop may also open a line for the opponent, or create a pawn weakness in your own structure. The decision is not automatic. The question is whether the bishop's increased activity justifies the structural cost, and the answer depends on what the bishop will actually do once it reaches the new diagonal. When the attacker holds both bishops, the pressure network becomes harder to defend against. Two bishops create diagonal threats on both color complexes simultaneously. A knight and bishop defender cannot match that coverage, because the knight controls only the squares it can reach, and the bishop controls only one color. Opening the position is therefore a common strategic goal when you hold the bishop pair, because open lines tend to increase the range of both bishops and reduce the knight's ability to compensate through outpost play. The exception is a knight that has already reached a strong outpost. A well-placed knight can neutralize a bishop's long-range pressure entirely by controlling the squares the bishop needs to be effective. This is why the sequence matters. Establishing the knight outpost before opening the position for the bishops is often the correct order of operations. The knight secures a fixed point of pressure. The bishops then operate around that fixed point, and the defender faces pressure from multiple directions that cannot all be addressed at once. In fortress-breaking positions, the key is not about each piece acting independently. Instead, it's about the synergy between them. The knight on the outpost restricts the defender's pieces and limits the bad bishop. The rook on the open file applies direct pressure to the backward pawn. The attacker's bishop pressures the pawn chain from a diagonal the defender cannot contest. Each piece is doing a specific job, and the jobs complement each other. This synergy is what transforms a correct structural diagnosis into an actual winning plan.